When the HOA board slapped that eviction notice on my door while I was at my PTSD therapy session, they had no idea they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their privileged lives. Picture this. I'm limping up my walkway on a rainy Thursday afternoon, leaning on my cane from that Fallujah injury that never quite healed right, only to find a laminated notice taped to my front door stating I had 72 hours to vacate my home of 6 years. The raindrops sliding down that plastic-covered paper seem to mock the tears I refuse to shed as I read the most absurd collection of violations I'd ever seen. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Unauthorized structural modifications, excessive lawn ornaments, failure to maintain exterior aesthetic standards, non-approved vehicle storage. The list went on like some kind of dystopian HOA manifesto. But here's what Barbara Wellington and her board of retired busybodies didn't know when they decided to target the disabled veteran in Unit 47. And trust me, this gets good. My military pension wasn't my only income source. The tech company I built during my recovery had just gone public. What would you do if your HOA illegally evicted you from the home where you'd finally found peace after 3 combat tours? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I bet your HOA has tried to pull some ridiculous stunts too. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. My name's James Reeves, and I'm a Marine Corps veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan before an IED cut my service short in 2014. After 18 months of surgeries and rehabilitation at Walter Reed, I purchased a modest 3-bedroom in Oakwood Heights using my VA loan. You know, the type of neighborhood cookie-cutter homes with just enough architectural variation to avoid looking completely identical, manicured community areas, and an HOA that treated their rulebook like Holy Scripture. I drive a customized 2012 Ford F-150 that's been adapted with hand control since my right leg doesn't work like it used to. It's not fancy, but it's reliable and modified to give me the independence I fought for. The truck has a Purple Heart veteran plate and a few military stickers, nothing flashy, just reminders of the life I'd lived and the brothers I'd lost. Oakwood Heights, like many American neighborhoods, had undergone a transformation over the past decade. Original homeowners, teachers, firefighters, nurses, and yes, veterans like me had built solid lives here when the development first opened. Then came the real estate boom, bringing waves of wealthy transplants with designer dogs and opinions about everyone else's lifestyle choices. Enter Barbara Wellington. Barbara was 53, with that specific type of blonde hair that required weekly maintenance at an overpriced salon. She'd moved to Oakwood Heights from some gated community in Connecticut about 4 years ago, bringing with her a dedication to property values that bordered on religious zealotry. She drove a Tesla Model X that she parked diagonally across 2 spaces to prevent door dings and conducted HOA business with the seriousness of someone negotiating nuclear disarmament treaties. The woman once reported an elderly resident for having wind chimes that were non-regulation bronze instead of the approved brushed nickel. I'm not joking. She's that neighbor. The trouble began innocently enough. After my 3rd back surgery, my VA occupational therapist recommended installing a small ramp over the 2 steps leading to my front door. Nothing elaborate, just a simple wooden structure with a gentle incline painted to match my house. One submitted. The modification request to the HOA, that's Architectural Committee, complete with doctor's notes explaining the medical necessity. 3 weeks later, Barbara herself knocked on my door, clipboard in hand and displeasure etched across her face like it had been carved there by a master sculptor. "Mr. Reeves," she said, extending a denial letter through the barely open door as if she might catch something from me. "The committee has reviewed your request and determined that wooden ramps are not aesthetically consistent with our community standards." I explained that the Americans with Disabilities Act protected my right to reasonable modifications. Her response was to blink slowly, as if I'd started speaking in tongues. "This is private property governed by covenants you signed when purchasing your home," she countered, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think they're the smartest person in every room. "The committee suggests you consider selling to someone more suited to our community infrastructure." The implication hung in the air between us, that my disability made me unsuitable for their precious neighborhood. That's when I first felt it. A slow burn of anger I hadn't experienced since waking up in that field hospital missing part of my leg. I built the ramp anyway. The Fair Housing Act was on my side, and I wasn't about to crawl into my own home to satisfy Barbara Wellington's aesthetic sensibilities. That ramp was just the beginning of what would become a systematic campaign of harassment disguised as rule enforcement. 2 days after completing the ramp, I received my first violation notice. Unauthorized exterior modification. $150 fine. It was followed quickly by notices about my truck, which apparently qualified as commercial industrial equipment because of its adaptive controls and the toolbox I kept secured in the bed. The citations became a weekly occurrence. My American flag was oversized and improperly displayed. The raised garden beds my therapist had recommended for physical activity were non-conforming agricultural installations. Even the specialized blackout curtains I needed for my PTSD triggered. Light sensitivity were flagged because they weren't the approved eggshell white or natural linen visible from the street. Each violation came with escalating fines, each more absurd than the last. When I tried to dispute them at the monthly HOA meeting, I discovered they'd changed the time without notifying me. When I emailed documentation supporting my medical exemptions, the messages mysteriously never arrived, despite my delivery receipts. It wasn't just bureaucratic bullying, it was methodical exclusion. The kind of slow, systemic pressure designed to make someone give up and leave voluntarily. The psychological impact was worse than the financial one. After years of therapy, I'd finally created a home that felt safe. A place where the hypervigilance could occasionally subside, where the nightmares came less frequently. Barbara and her board were systematically dismantling that security, triggering anxiety responses I'd worked years to manage. My neighbors were divided. The Johnsons next door, whose son was currently deployed with the Navy, brought me dinner and offered to help fight the violations. Mrs. Patel across the street slipped me a note saying she disagreed with the board, but was afraid to speak up for fear of becoming their next target. Meanwhile, Barbara's circle of supporters, mostly newer residents who'd paid premium prices for their homes, nodded in solemn agreement during meetings about maintaining community standards. Things escalated when I installed security cameras. After finding my mailbox damaged and garbage mysteriously scattered across my lawn multiple times, within 48 hours, I received a violation for unauthorized surveillance equipment and a notice that my cameras had to be removed immediately as they infringed on community privacy expectations. That's when I contacted Dan Martinez, an attorney specializing in housing discrimination who'd worked with my veteran support group. Her initial review of my case included a phrase that would change everything. "This isn't just harassment. James, what they're doing crosses several legal lines." Knowledge nugget 1. Housing discrimination against persons with disabilities is illegal under federal law, regardless of what your HOA covenants say. No association can enforce rules that effectively deny you equal access to housing opportunities. What Barbara and her board didn't realize was that while they were playing petty neighborhood politics, I was building an extensive case documentation. Every violation notice, every email, every board meeting recording, all meticulously cataloged with military precision. The security cameras they wanted removed had captured board members walking onto my property to take pictures of supposed violations. Some had even been caught tampering with my mailbox, a federal offense. they clearly thought would go unnoticed. But the final straw, the action that would transform this neighborhood forever, came while I was attending my weekly PTSD therapy session at the VA hospital. I returned home to find that laminated eviction notice, citing accumulated unpaid fines and continuous violations as justification for terminating my residency under some obscure bylaw they'd apparently added during a closed executive session. 72 hours to vacate the home that had sheltered my recovery. 3 days to abandon the only place that felt safe since returning from war. The rain continued to fall as I stood there, my service-connected injuries throbbing from the dampness, reading a document that effectively declared I was too broken for their perfect community. What Barbara Wellington didn't know as she authorized that eviction notice was that she had just declared war on someone trained to win them. And unlike the conflicts I'd fought overseas, this was one battle where I held the superior position, resources, and intelligence. The tech security company I'd built during my recovery, initially just a way to keep my mind occupied during the darkest days of rehabilitation, had recently been acquired by a major defense contractor. The IPO payout sitting in my investment accounts wasn't just life-changing money. It was neighborhood buying money. And Barbara Wellington had just handed me both the motivation and moral justification to use it. I didn't waste time with anger combat. Teaches you that emotion without strategy is just wasted energy. Instead, I made 3 calls that would change everything. First to Diane Martinez, my attorney, forwarding her the eviction notice with a simple message. They've crossed the line. Go weapons free. The legal term for what I was authorizing is aggressive countermeasures, but in my mind, it was simply permission to stop playing defense. The second call went to Michael Chen, my financial advisor who'd helped structure my company's recent acquisition. Remember that diversification strategy we discussed? I want to accelerate the real estate portion, specifically in Oakwood Heights. There was a pause before Michael's careful response. That's unusually targeted for an investment strategy. Any particular reason? My answer was simple. Let's just say I've developed intimate knowledge of this particular market. The third call was to Sam Rodriguez, my former squad leader who now ran a private investigation firm staffed entirely by veterans. I need everything on Barbara Wellington and the Oakwood Heights HOA board. Financial records, communication patterns, property histories, personal vulnerabilities, full tactical assessment. Sam didn't ask questions. That's why we'd survived Fallujah together. Knowledge nugget 2. Most HOA board members are volunteers with minimal understanding of actual housing law. Their power comes from homeowner apathy and the assumption that their authority is absolute. Neither is true. While Barbara thought she was dealing with a disabled veteran being forced out of his home, I was assembling an elite team focused on neighborhood liberation. Diane began with an emergency injunction against the eviction, citing multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Her 47-page filing detailed every instance of harassment and discrimination, complete with timestamps, photographs, and witness statements from sympathetic neighbors. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 1 day before my supposed eviction deadline. Barbara attended with the HOA's attorney, a young associate from a mid-tier firm, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the judge reviewed our evidence. Judge Hernandez, a Vietnam-era Navy veteran himself, seemed particularly interested in the section documenting how board meetings regarding my property were intentionally rescheduled without notice. Ms. Wellington, he said, peering over reading glasses that magnify his already intense gaze, am I understanding correctly that your board denied reasonable accommodations for a combat-disabled veteran while simultaneously preventing him from attending the very meetings where these decisions were made? Barbara's response was predictably tone-deaf. Your Honor, Our community has aesthetic standards that all residents agree to maintain. Mr. Reeves' modifications. Judge Hernandez cut her off with a raised hand. Ms. Wellington, I didn't ask about your aesthetic standards. I asked about your apparent pattern of discrimination against a protected class individual. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Injunction granted pending full hearing. The court finds substantial evidence of potentially discriminatory practices warranting immediate intervention. The look on Barbara's face as we left the courtroom was worth every painful physical therapy session I'd endured. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And justice was just beginning, while the legal battle provided immediate protection. Sam's investigation was yielding information that would prove far more valuable long-term. The Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association had been incorporated in 1997 when the development was first built. The original documents listed the developer, Westfield Construction, as maintaining certain special rights until all properties were sold. These included the ability to appoint board members, modify bylaws, and most importantly retain ownership, interest in common areas and infrastructure. Westfield had gone bankrupt in 2008 during the housing crisis, and their assets had been liquidated through a complex series of transactions. The HOA had simply assumed control of everything, but Sam discovered a critical oversight. The special developer rights had never been properly transferred or terminated. They'd been acquired by a holding company that was subsequently dissolved, leaving those rights in legal limbo. Knowledge nugget 3. Many HOAs operate on assumptions about their authority rather than verified legal documentation. Always research the chain of title for your association's controlling documents. Meanwhile, Michael was executing my investment strategy with surgical precision. Using a series of LLCs with deliberately generic names, we began acquiring properties throughout Oakwood Heights. The housing market had cooled slightly, and several homeowners were eager to sell to our all-cash offers with flexible closing dates. Each property was purchased at fair market value. I wasn't looking to take advantage of anyone, except those who'd tried to take advantage of me. Barbara and her board remained oblivious, focused entirely on the upcoming discrimination hearing and the temporary restraining order preventing them from taking action against me. Their attorney had advised them to avoid any contact, creating the perfect operational environment for my team. By the time the full hearing date arrived 3 weeks later, my investment group owned 11 properties in Oakwood Heights. Not enough for control, but enough to establish a presence. More importantly, we'd identified the legal path to something much more significant. The courtroom was more crowded this time. News of a disabled veteran fighting his HOA had attracted local media interest, and several veterans advocacy groups had sent representatives. Barbara arrived with the HOA's new counsel. They'd upgraded to a senior partner from a prestigious firm specializing in real estate law. This lawyer, Harrison Montgomery, had a reputation for aggressive defense of property developers and associations. He presented a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA was simply enforcing agreed-upon covenants that I had voluntarily accepted when purchasing my home. His carefully constructed argument emphasized community standards, property values, and contractual obligations. It was textbook. HOA defense strategy appealed to property values and contractual sanctity while avoiding any discussion of discrimination. When my turn came, Diane approached the bench with quiet confidence. Your Honor, before addressing Mr. Montgomery's motion, we'd like to introduce new evidence that fundamentally alters the nature of this case. She presented documents from the county recorder's office, the state business registry, and the original developer's bankruptcy proceedings. These records demonstrate that the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association has been operating without legal authority for over 15 years. The special developer rights were never properly transferred following Westfield Construction's bankruptcy. The current board has been enforcing rules, collecting fees, and now attempting to evict my client without any legitimate legal basis for doing so. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hernandez called for order, then spent several minutes reviewing the documents. When he looked up, his expression had transformed from professional interest to something closer to astonishment. "Mr. Montgomery, are you familiar with these documents?" The attorney requested a brief recess to consult with his clients. When they returned, Montgomery's demeanor had noticeably shifted. "Your Honor, we request a continuance to investigate these unexpected allegations." Judge Hernandez denied the continuance, but extended the temporary restraining order preventing any action against me. This court takes allegations of discrimination against protected classes extremely seriously, particularly when those individuals have served our country. The additional questions regarding the HOA's legal authority only compound my concerns. As we left the courthouse, reporters surrounded us on the steps. Diane handled most questions with professional restraint, but when someone asked me directly how it felt to be fighting this battle, I couldn't help myself. In Afghanistan, I learned that the most dangerous threats often hide behind official-looking paperwork and assumed authority. Some things don't change when you come home. The quote made the evening news alongside Barbara's tight-lipped "no comment" as she hurried to her Tesla. That night, I hosted a meeting at my home, the first gathering of what would become the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Alliance. 12 neighbors, including the Johnsons, Mrs. Patel, and several others who'd quietly supported me, listened as Diane explained what we'd discovered. The HOA as it currently exists has no legal authority to enforce rules, collect fees, or manage common areas, she explained as coffee was passed around my living room. They've been operating on assumed power that no one challenged until now. Mrs. Patel, who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built, shook her head in disbelief. "We've been paying them thousands in fees for years. What happens to all that? Money? That's one of many questions they'll have to answer," I replied. "But more importantly, we have an opportunity to rebuild this community the right way. Inclusive, transparent, and fair." The meeting lasted until midnight, with neighbors sharing their own stories of intimidation and selective enforcement. The Alvarez family had been fined for having their grandchildren visit for more than the approved 2-week guest period. Mr. Johansson, an elderly widower, had received violations for his medical alert system's exterior components. Each story reinforced what I already knew: Barbara's regime wasn't about property values. It was about control and exclusion. As my neighbors left that night, something had changed. The isolation Barbara had cultivated as a control tactic had been broken. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans for future meetings, offered to help each other fight unfair violations. Community was forming in direct opposition to her divisive leadership. What none of us realized was that Barbara had stationed her most loyal supporter, Gregory Phillips from 2 streets over, in a car near my home. He photographed everyone entering and leaving, creating a blacklist that would be used for the HOA's next retaliatory move. 3 days later, everyone who'd attended my meeting received identical violation notices for participating in commercial activity in a residential zone. The fines were $500 each, with escalation clauses for continued violations. It was a desperate move from someone watching their power crumble, but it had the opposite effect of what Barbara intended. Instead of intimidating my supporters, she united them. Meanwhile, my investment strategy accelerated. Michael had identified the holding company that had acquired the defunct developer's special rights during bankruptcy. A series of negotiations, backed by significant financial resources, resulted in the purchase of these rights for a surprisingly reasonable sum. The sellers had no idea what they actually owned to them. It was just worthless paper from a long-dead construction company. Knowledge nugget 4. Corporate assets in bankruptcy often get separated from their original context. Rights, easements, and legal authorities can be acquired for pennies on the dollar by those who understand their true value. By the time Barbara Wellington realized what was happening, it was already too late. The financial and legal groundwork had been laid for something she couldn't possibly have anticipated when she decided to target the disabled veteran in Unit 47, something that would transform Oakwood Heights forever and teach her exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness and accommodation for vulnerability. The full impact of our legal discovery hit Oakwood Heights like a precision airstrike. Judge Hernandez issued a preliminary ruling that sent shockwaves through the community. The court finds substantial evidence that the current Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association lacks legal standing to enforce covenants, collect assessments, or take adverse actions against property owners. Within hours, the neighborhood exploded with reactions ranging from celebration to panic. Barbara called an emergency board meeting at the community clubhouse, apparently forgetting that she technically had no authority to use the facility. I attended with Diane and 3 other homeowners, taking seats in the back as Barbara attempted to project confidence from behind a folding table adorned with an official-looking HOA tablecloth. "This is a temporary legal misunderstanding," she assured the packed room, her voice carrying that particular strain people get when they're trying to convince themselves as much as others. "Our attorneys are confident that once all documentation is properly reviewed, our authority will be fully restored." Harrison Montgomery, the expensive attorney they'd hired, looked considerably less confident. He carefully explained that they were pursuing multiple legal remedies, including attempting to retroactively validate the HOA's authority through court proceedings. What he tactfully avoided mentioning was that such validation would require the consent of whoever now held the developer's special rights, which happened to be my investment group. When the floor opened for questions, the atmosphere turned volatile. Residents demanded to know what had happened to their assessment payments. Others questioned whether the landscaping and maintenance services would continue. Several people who'd received violation notices wanted to know if they still needed to pay their fines. Mrs. Patterson, an elementary school teacher who'd received violations for her excessively colorful garden, asked the question everyone was thinking: if the HOA has been operating without authority, doesn't that mean all the fines and rules have been illegitimate from the beginning? Barbara's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck. "That's a legal question that—" "Yes," Diane interrupted, standing up from our back row seats. "Under state law, any fines or enforcement actions taken without proper legal authority are unenforceable. Additionally, all assessment funds collected under false pretenses may be subject to restitution claims." The room erupted. Barbara frantically banged a gavel that technically held no power. "This meeting is for board communications only. Unauthorized legal opinions are not welcome." I stood next to Diane, my service-connected injuries making the movement slower than I'd like, but no less deliberate. "Actually, Barbara, as the current holder of the developer's special rights for Oakwood Heights, I have more authority to speak in this meeting than you do." The silence that followed was absolute. Every head turned toward me, expressions ranging from confusion to dawning comprehension. Barbara's face went from flushed to pallid in seconds. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, but the slight tremor in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "My investment group has acquired all special developer rights for Oakwood Heights as outlined in the original 1997 incorporation documents," I explained, my combat-trained voice projecting clearly through the room without needing to shout. "These rights were never properly transferred during the Westfield bankruptcy proceedings. They include authority over common areas, infrastructure, and most importantly, the ability to appoint board members and modify bylaws." Harrison Montgomery was already on his phone, frantically texting someone. Barbara's knuckles whitened around her gavel. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "You can't just buy control of an established HOA." "I didn't," I replied calmly. I purchased legitimate developer rights that your board failed to properly research when assuming control. Rights that give me legal authority over much of what you've been claiming to control for years. Knowledge. Nugget 5. Always verify the chain of title on HOA controlling documents. Many associations operate on assumptions rather than legal facts, creating vulnerabilities that can completely undermine their claimed authority. That meeting ended in chaos, but it marked the beginning of Oakwood Heights' transformation. Within days, I filed court documents officially exercising the developer's rights to dissolve the current board and establish interim leadership until proper elections could be held. Judge Hernandez, citing the extraordinary circumstances and pattern of discriminatory behavior, granted an expedited hearing and ultimately approved the restructuring. The financial audit that followed revealed what many had suspected. Under Barbara's leadership, the HOA had amassed a surplus of nearly $340,000 money, collected for community improvements that had instead been sitting in an interest-bearing account, while necessary repairs were perpetually postponed. Even worse, the board had been selectively enforcing rules based on what appeared to be personal vendettas rather than actual violations. The Alvarez family, for instance, had received over $4,000 in fines for alleged infractions that identical homes owned by board members, friends had committed without consequence. Mrs. Patel's medical accommodation requests had been lost 3 times, while Barbara's request for an oversized gazebo had been approved in record time. While the legal system slowly processed these revelations, my real estate strategy continued. By the time Barbara realized the full extent of what was happening, my investment group owned 27 properties in Oakwood Heights, nearly 40% of the neighborhood. Each purchase was conducted through different LLCs, keeping the pattern hidden until it was too late to counter. The moment that Barbara finally understood she'd lost came during the court-mandated transfer of HOA records. I'd arranged to meet her at the clubhouse, now legally under my management, to receive the financial documents, meeting minutes and correspondence files the judge had ordered preserved. She arrived looking noticeably different. The designer outfits had been replaced with simple business casual. The luxury handbag was missing, and her Tesla had been traded for a more modest Subaru. Rumors had circulated that Harrison Montgomery's legal fees had already exceeded $50,000 with nothing to show for it but defeat. "You've destroyed everything we built here," she said as she handed over the file boxes, unable to meet my eyes. "No, Barbara," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I'm rebuilding what you tried to destroy, a community where everyone belongs, not just the people you approve of." Something shifted in her expression then, not quite understanding, but perhaps the first crack in her certainty. This was never personal. It was about maintaining standards. It became personal the moment you decided a disabled veteran didn't belong in your vision of a perfect neighborhood, I said. The moment you chose property values over people's dignity. As she turned to leave, I added, "By the way, your lease terms will be in your mailbox tomorrow." She froze. "My what?" "Your home was purchased last week by Reeves Community Development," I explained. "One of my companies. Don't worry, and like you, I don't believe in unfair evictions. You're welcome to stay as a tenant, though there will be some adjustments to the monthly rate." The neighborhood transformation accelerated after that. With control of both the developer rights and a significant percentage of properties, I had the legal authority to implement comprehensive changes. The first was dissolving the punitive fine system that had been Barbara's primary control mechanism. In its place, we established a community mediation program where neighbors could resolve disputes through facilitated conversation rather than financial penalties. The $340,000 HOA surplus was allocated to long overdue infrastructure improvements. The clubhouse, which had been inaccessible to residents with mobility issues, despite ADA requirements, received proper ramps and accessible facilities. The community pool finally got the safety upgrades that had been postponed for years. Sidewalks were repaired, street lighting improved, and the playground equipment that had been deemed aesthetically unsuitable was replaced with modern, accessible structures that all children could enjoy. Most importantly, we rewrote the community covenants from scratch. The new rules focused on safety and structural integrity rather than aesthetic control. Reasonable accommodations for disabilities were explicitly protected. Cultural and religious expression through holiday decorations and ceremonies was officially welcomed rather than regulated. The architectural review process was simplified and made transparent, with clear timelines for decisions and an appeals process overseen by rotating community members. For properties I didn't own, I offered long-term homeowners the opportunity to purchase their homes from their landlords, helping arrange favorable financing for veterans, teachers, healthcare workers, and other community contributors who'd been slowly priced out of homeownership. For properties I did own, I established reasonable rent controls that prevented the kind of predatory increases Barbara and her friends had benefited from. Knowledge Nugget 6. Community governance works best when it focuses on inclusion rather than exclusion. Rules should exist to protect people, not property values at the expense of people. As for Barbara and her former board members, they experienced something they'd never anticipated: accountability with compassion. Yes, their rents increased, though nowhere near the 300% that neighborhood gossip had predicted. The increase was simply an adjustment to actual market rates rather than the artificially low amounts they'd been paying due to their connections. More significantly, they were required to complete community service hours as part of their continued residency. Barbara found herself volunteering at the very VA hospital where I received treatment, assisting veterans with mobility issues, including helping them navigate the building using wheelchairs and walking aids. The experience changed her in ways no fine or punishment ever could have. Gregory Phillips, who'd photographed my community meeting attendees, was assigned to help coordinate the neighborhood's new cultural celebration series, working directly with the diverse families he'd once helped target. The banker who'd rubber-stamped Barbara's financial decisions now helped run financial literacy workshops for neighborhood teens and seniors, 6 months after the eviction notice that had started. Everything. Oakwood Heights held its first legitimate board election in 15 years. The new board included Mrs. Patel, Mr. Johnson, and representatives from across the neighborhood's demographic spectrum. I declined nomination, preferring to focus on the broader community development projects my unexpected wealth could support. Night of the election, as residents gathered in the newly renovated clubhouse to hear the results, I found myself standing at the back of the room, watching people who'd once been afraid to speak to their neighbors now engaged in animated conversations about community improvements. Children played in the corner area we'd created specifically for families attending meetings. Elderly residents who'd previously been unable to navigate the building's steps sat comfortably in the new, accessible seating areas. Mrs. Patterson approached, offering me a cup of coffee from the refreshment table. "You know, when you first moved in, I worried you might not stay long," she admitted. "So many younger people just use this as a starter neighborhood. But I think I understand now why you fought so hard to stay." I nodded, watching the diverse group of neighbors, some who'd supported me from the beginning, others who'd followed Barbara until they saw the truth, even a few former board members who'd found humility through service. "This isn't just housing," I said, "it's home." The transformation of Oakwood Heights caught the attention of local media first. The Westridge Tribune ran a feature titled "Veteran Turns HOA Battle into Community Renaissance," complete with before and after photos of the neighborhood's improvements. What had once been a collection of nearly identical houses governed by arbitrary restrictions had evolved into a vibrant community where individual expression was balanced with reasonable standards. Channel 7's Community Spotlight segment filmed Residents enjoying the newly renovated park space where Barbara had once prohibited children's birthday parties as excessive gatherings. The reporters seemed particularly interested in the story of the Newing family, who had been previously fined for their vegetable garden, but were now leading the community garden project that supplied fresh produce to elderly residents. "We were always afraid to check our mailbox," Mrs. Nguyen explained on camera, gesturing toward the thriving garden beds that had replaced a rarely used decorative lawn. "Every week, another violation, another fine. Now we help our neighbors grow food and share cultural recipes. This is what community should be." The regional coverage eventually attracted national attention. A major news magazine contacted me about featuring Oakwood Heights in a special report on housing discrimination and community governance. Their interest wasn't just in my personal story but in the systemic changes we'd implemented, particularly our approach to property management that prioritized stability over profit maximization. While many landlords in surrounding areas had raised rents by 10 to 15% annually, pushing out long-term residents, my properties maintained stable rates tied to actual maintenance costs rather than speculative market values. The few rent increases I did implement were modest and came with tangible improvements to the properties. When tenants expressed interest in eventual homeownership, we created pathways through rent-to-own programs, specifically designed for their financial situations. Knowledge. Nugget 7. Ethical property management can be financially sustainable while still being socially responsible. The choice between profitability and community welfare is often a false dichotomy, created by short-term thinking. Barbara Wellington's transformation proved as newsworthy as the neighborhoods. After 3 months of mandatory volunteer work at the VA hospital, she approached me after a community meeting, her expression uncharacteristically humble. "I've been working with a Marine who lost both legs in Syria," she said, studying her coffee cup rather than meeting my eyes. "He told me something that's been keeping me awake at night. He said the hardest part wasn't the physical recovery, it was coming home to a country that seemed to have no place for him anymore." I waited, giving her the space to continue. "I never saw it that way," she admitted. "I thought rules and property values were what made a community desirable. I never considered that my standards were actually barriers keeping people out." She finally looked up. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, James. I just wanted you to know that I'm learning." It wasn't a Hollywood moment of instant redemption, but it was something more valuable, genuine growth. Barbara would never be the community leader she once appointed herself, but she was becoming something more important. A thoughtful neighbor. Her lease agreement included a stipulation that she complete 200 hours of community service annually. After fulfilling her required time, she continued volunteering at the VA hospital's mobility clinic, eventually becoming a paid coordinator. The woman who had once measured grass height with a ruler now helped wounded warriors navigate their new physical realities. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, but neither was the poetic justice. The skills that had made Barbara an effective HOA tyrant, attention to detail, procedural knowledge, and unwavering persistence, were now directed toward helping veterans access benefits and accommodations they desperately needed. As for the other board members, their journeys varied. Some moved away, unwilling to live in a community where they couldn't enforce their vision of uniformity. Others, like Gregory Phillips, discovered unexpected fulfillment in community service. The former compliance monitor who had photographed my allies now organized Oakwood Heights cultural heritage celebrations, working with families from diverse backgrounds to showcase traditions that had once been suppressed by HOA regulations. Financial aspect of my neighborhood acquisition proved more complex than simply collecting rent. My original impulse raising rates by 300% on those who had tried to evict me had been emotionally satisfying but strategically flawed. Instead, I implemented a graduated system that reflected both market realities and community values. Elderly residents on fixed incomes, rates remained essentially unchanged, with modest adjustments for actual maintenance costs. For middle-income families, especially those with children in local schools, we created stability agreements that limited increases to prevent displacement. The highest increases, nowhere near 300%, but still substantial, were reserved for investment properties owned by absentee landlords who had benefited from the previous board's preferential treatment. This nuanced approach accomplished something more valuable than revenge. It created accountability while preserving community stability. The resulting financial model proved so effective that property management companies from neighboring developments began inquiring about our methodology. Knowledge Nugget 8. Real estate investment can be both profitable and ethical when it prioritizes community sustainability over maximum short-term returns. Long-term tenants, reduced turnover, and community stability often create better financial outcomes than extractive models. The legal implications of our HOA revolution extended far beyond Oakwood Heights. Diane began receiving calls from homeowners across the state facing similar situations: discriminatory enforcement, questionable financial practices, and boards operating without proper legal authority. She eventually established a specialized practice focused on HOA reform, with a sliding fee scale that made legal representation accessible to homeowners of all income levels. Our case became required reading in several law schools' housing law courses. The precedent established by Judge Hernandez's ruling that HOAs could not enforce discriminatory policies even when disguised as neutral rules strengthened protections for disabled residents, families with children, religious minorities, and other groups frequently targeted by selective enforcement. Meanwhile, my personal journey continued. The trauma that had followed me home from Fallujah hadn't magically disappeared with my victory over Barbara's regime. The nightmares still came, though less frequently. The hypervigilance remained, though its focus had shifted from personal survival to community protection. My injuries still limited my physical capabilities, though the accommodations I'd fought for made those limitations less defining. What had changed was my sense of purpose. The skills I'd developed in combat strategic thinking, threat assessment, team building under pressure had found new application in community development. The leadership training the Marines had invested in me was now serving the civilian sector. Even my experience with trauma had become valuable, helping me understand and advocate for others facing systemic obstacles. The physical renovation of my home became a metaphor for this evolution. The ramp that had started the conflict was now just one element of a comprehensively accessible design that welcomed visitors of all abilities. The security cameras that had documented Barbara's harassment now monitored a vibrant street, where children played freely and neighbors gathered without fear of violation notices. Inside, the specialized adaptations for my disabilities were integrated seamlessly with spaces designed for community gatherings. The dining room that had hosted that first clandestine meeting of resistance, now regularly filled with neighbors for potluck dinners that celebrated our diverse culinary traditions. The office where I'd planned my legal strategy had expanded to accommodate interns from the local community college's urban planning program. 1 year after the eviction notice that had triggered everything, we held the first annual Oakwood Heights Community Congress, an open forum where residents collectively established priorities for the coming year. The process was structured to ensure that all voices carried equal weight, regardless of whether they owned or rented, how long they had lived in the neighborhood, or what connections they might have. The meeting was held in the community center that had once been the exclusive domain of Barbara's inner circle. Now it buzzed with energetic conversations in multiple languages as working groups tackled issues from child care cooperatives to senior transportation networks. The former boardroom where violation notices had been approved now hosted a youth Council where neighborhood teenagers develop leadership skills while advocating for their needs. Mrs. Patel, now serving as the democratically elected community board president, opened the session with a reflection that captured our journey. 1 year ago, many of us were afraid to speak to our neighbors. Today, we are planning our future together. The concrete outcomes of that first Congress included initiatives that would have been unimaginable under the previous regime. A tool-sharing library that reduced consumption while building practical skills. A community Wi-Fi network that ensured all residents had reliable internet access. A rideshare program coordinated by and for neighborhood seniors. And a skills exchange that matched residents' needs with others' abilities. From language tutoring to home repairs, my role had evolved from revolutionary to resource provider, offering financial backing, technical assistance, and connection to external partners when needed, but otherwise allowing organic community leadership to flourish. This approach created sustainability beyond what any single leader could accomplish. When I occasionally traveled for business or VA treatments, the community's momentum continued uninterrupted. The most profound change, however, wasn't in policies or programs, but in the neighborhood's psychological landscape. The fear that had once permeated Oakwood Heights, fear of violation notices, of selective enforcement, of being deemed unsuitable, had been replaced by a culture of belonging. Residents who had once avoided eye contact now greeted each other by name. Homes that had been maintained out of fear of fines were now improved out of pride and self-expression. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. This transformation became evident during an unexpected municipal inspection. The city's code enforcement officer, responding to an anonymous complaint, likely filed by a former board member still holding a grudge, arrived prepared to document violations. Instead, he found a neighborhood where safety and functionality coexisted with diverse expression. "I've been doing this job for 17 years, he told me as we walked the community together, and I've never seen an HOA neighborhood with this balance of personalization and maintenance standards. Usually it's either sterile uniformity or complete chaos. That balance hadn't happened by accident. Our new governance approach focused on outcomes rather than prescriptive rules. Instead of dictating specific plants, colors, or designs, our standards established basic parameters for safety, accessibility, and consideration of neighbors, then allowed homeowners freedom within those parameters. The result was a community where a retired engineer's precisely manicured landscape could exist harmoniously next door to an art teacher's wildflower meadow, where traditional holiday decorations from diverse cultures were welcomed rather than regulated, where the needs of residents with disabilities were treated as design opportunities rather than inconvenient exceptions. As word of our approach spread, property values increased, not because of artificial restrictions, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a community that balanced individual expression with collective well-being. The waiting list for available rentals grew, and when homes occasionally came up for sale, they received multiple offers despite never imposing the draconian restrictions that Barbara had insisted were necessary for market value. Knowledge nugget 9. True community value comes from creating places where people want to live, not just where they can afford to buy. Investment in human connections and inclusive governance often generates greater financial returns than restrictive covenants and punitive enforcement. On a personal level, the greatest reward came not from defeating Barbara or even from the financial success of my investment strategy. It came from creating the community that I had needed but couldn't find when I first returned from combat. A place where adaptation wasn't just tolerated but valued, where difference was seen as contribution rather than deviation, and where my service-connected disabilities became just one facet of my identity rather than a reason for exclusion. The ripple effects of Oakwood Heights transformation extended far beyond our property lines. Neighboring communities began sending representatives to observe our governance model, curious about how we'd achieved both resident satisfaction and property appreciation without restrictive enforcement. The Willowbrook Estate's HOA president, notorious for his heavy-handed approach, attended one of our quarterly meetings and left visibly unsettled by what he'd witnessed. "So you're telling me there's no violation notice system at all?" he asked as I walked into his car afterward. "How do you maintain standards without enforcement mechanisms?" "We shifted from punishment to support," I explained. "Instead of finding someone for peeling paint, we created a maintenance assistance program where neighbors help neighbors. The results are better than what fear ever produced." He shook his head, clearly struggling with the concept. "But without consequences, what motivates people to comply?" "Community belonging is a stronger motivator than fear of punishment," I said. "People maintain their properties because they feel invested in the neighborhood, not because they're afraid of getting a notice." The conversation illustrated the fundamental shift we'd created, from coercive compliance to collaborative community. Within 6 months, 3 nearby HOAs had adopted elements of our approach, though most stopped short of the complete restructuring we'd implemented. Change comes gradually to institutions built on control. Even more significant was the impact on municipal policy. The Westridge City Council, impressed by our success, invited me to join a task force examining housing discrimination across the region. The data we uncovered was sobering. Disabled residents faced accommodation denials at 5 times the rate of the general population. Families with children encountered both formal and informal barriers to housing. And veterans like myself often struggled to find communities that understood their unique needs. Working with council members, we drafted ordinances strengthening protections against discriminatory housing practices, with specific provisions addressing HOA overreach. The resulting legislation, nicknamed the Oakwood Act, established clear boundaries for community associations, while creating accessible complaint processes for residents experiencing discrimination. Knowledge Nugget 10. Local government often has more power to regulate HOAs than residents realize. Municipal ordinances can provide protections beyond state and federal law, particularly regarding discrimination and reasonable accommodations. My advocacy work expanded to the state level, where I testified before legislative committees considering HOA reform. The hearings brought me face to face with industry lobbyists who characterized our Oakwood Heights model as radical and anti-property rights. Their arguments revealed how thoroughly they'd conflated property rights with control rights. Ability to dictate others' choices rather than simply protect one's own investments. Mr. Reeves, one particularly aggressive industry representative, challenged during a public comment session, "Your approach may work in your specific community, but it would create chaos if implemented broadly. Don't homeowners have the right to protect their property values through enforceable standards?" "Homeowners absolutely have rights," I responded, leaning slightly on my cane as I stood at the microphone, "including the right to be free from discriminatory enforcement disguised as standards. What we've demonstrated is that property values actually increase when communities focus on inclusion rather than restriction." The legislative battle continued. For months, with industry groups fighting to maintain HOAs, largely unregulated power, while consumer advocates pushed for meaningful oversight. The compromise legislation ultimately established state-level protections against the most egregious abuses while creating transparency requirements for associations' financial and enforcement activities. Meanwhile, my personal journey continued alongside the community's evolution. The tech security company I'd built post-military had expanded its focus to include accessible design solutions for disabled veterans, everything from smart home systems controlled by voice or limited mobility to security features addressing the specific needs of those with PTSD and hypervigilance conditions. The work brought me into regular contact with recently returned veterans facing the same challenges I'd encountered years earlier. Their stories often mirrored my own: combat experiences that had forever changed them, physical limitations that required environmental adaptations, and communities that viewed these differences as problems rather than just another form of human diversity. 1 Marine, a 26-year-old with a traumatic brain injury from an IED in Afghanistan, particularly reminded me of my younger self. Ryan Collins had been living with his parents since medical retirement, unable to find housing that accommodated both his physical needs and his service dog, a German shepherd named Valor, who helped him navigate public spaces and manage anxiety. Every place I apply either rejects the dog outright or claims they don't have suitable units for someone with my requirements, he explained during one of our technology consultation sessions. The frustration in his voice was painfully familiar. One landlord actually suggested I should consider special housing instead of a regular apartment complex. The conversation sparked an idea that would eventually become Homeward Bound, a nonprofit dedicated to creating integrated housing solutions for disabled veterans. Using seed funding from my tech company profits and the property management expertise we developed at Oakwood Heights, we began acquiring strategic properties throughout the region. Each building was renovated for universal accessibility, with specialized options for various disability profiles and inclusive community spaces designed to foster connection rather than isolation. The first Homeward Bound residence opened 18 months after my confrontation with Barbara Wellington. The 24-unit building included apartments ranging from studios to 3 bedrooms, accommodating single veterans and those with families. Ryan Collins and Valor became our first residents, moving into a 1-bedroom unit specifically adapted for his cognitive and physical needs. The building's design reflected everything we'd learned about creating truly inclusive environments. Hallways were wide enough for comfortable wheelchair navigation, but didn't feel institutional. Lighting systems could be adjusted for those with sensory sensitivities. Common areas included both gathering spaces for community building and quiet retreats for residents who needed low-stimulation environments. Most importantly, the residents integrated supportive services without creating an institutional atmosphere. On-site staff included a benefits coordinator who helped navigate the labyrinthine VA system, a vocational counselor connecting residents with employment and education opportunities, and peer support specialist veterans themselves who understood the unique challenges of military to civilian transition. Barbara Wellington, continuing her remarkable evolution, volunteered to help coordinate transportation services for residents, needing regular medical appointments. When I encountered her in the building's community room, organizing the volunteer driver schedule, the contrast with our first interactions couldn't have been more striking. "The VA hospital shuttle system has these gaps on weekends," she explained, showing me the color-coded spreadsheet she'd created. "We've got 15 volunteer drivers covering the schedule now, but we really need 20 for full coverage." Her organizational skills, once directed toward finding violations and issuing fines, were now focused on solving genuine community needs. The transformation wasn't just in her activities, but in her fundamental understanding of what created value in a community: not uniformity and restriction, but support and inclusion. As Homeward Bound expanded to additional locations, we refined the model based on resident feedback and outcomes data. The third location included a small business incubator specifically designed for veteran entrepreneurs, providing both workspace and mentorship. The fourth incorporated an intergenerational component, with programming that connected veteran residents to both school children and seniors in the surrounding neighborhood. Knowledge nugget 11. Inclusive design benefits everyone, not just those with identified disabilities. Features like zero-step entrances, lever door handles, and adjustable lighting improve usability for all residents, while making spaces genuinely accessible for those with specific needs. The professional impact of this work brought unexpected recognition. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government featured our housing model in a case study on innovative approaches to veteran reintegration. A major foundation provided multi-year funding to expand Homeward Bound nationally. Senator Martinez, herself a Navy veteran, invited me to consult on federal legislation addressing the housing crisis facing disabled veterans. Yet the most meaningful validation came from the residents themselves. During the first anniversary celebration of our initial property, Ryan Collins, now working part-time as a computer security analyst while completing his degree, approached me with valor, calmly walking beside him. "Before moving here, I hadn't slept through the night in 3 years," he said, one hand resting on his service dog's head. "The hypervigilance was so bad I was checking locks 5-6 times before I could even try to sleep. Now I actually wake up rested most days." His experience echoed what research was confirming across our properties. Residents showed measurable improvements in mental health metrics, reduced need for certain medications, higher employment rates, and stronger social connections compared to similar veterans in traditional housing situations. These outcomes attracted attention from VA administrators seeking to improve their transitional housing programs. During a tour of our flagship property with the regional VA director, I shared the design principles that had proven most effective. The key insight was recognizing that environmental factors dramatically impact recovery trajectories. I explained as we walked through spaces specifically designed to mitigate common triggers for PTSD and TBI symptoms. Physical accommodations are relatively straightforward: grab bars, accessible controls, sensory-friendly lighting. The real innovation was creating environments that support psychological recovery through both design and community structure. The VA director, a career administrator who had seen countless programs come and go, seemed genuinely impressed. "What's remarkable is how normal it all feels," she observed. "Nothing screams special housing or disability facility. It just feels like a really well-designed apartment building." That was precisely the point. Our approach rejected the false dichotomy between special accommodations and normal housing, instead creating universally designed environments that worked better for everyone while specifically supporting those with unique needs. This philosophy extended to our community governance model as well. Rather than imposing a predetermined structure, each Homeward Bound residence developed its own community agreements to facilitate processes that ensured all voices were included. The resulting systems varied based on resident preferences, but shared common elements of transparency, flexibility, and mutual support. At the original Oakwood Heights, this approach had continued evolving beyond my direct involvement. The community board elected after Barbara's departure had implemented rotating leadership positions to prevent power consolidation, term limits to ensure fresh perspectives, and consensus-based decision-making for significant policy changes. Mrs. Patel, after serving her 2-year term as president, stepped into a mentorship role for newer residents interested in community leadership. The Johnsons established an orientation program, helping newcomers understand the neighborhood's history and governance philosophy. Even former board members who had supported Barbara's regime found roles that utilized their skills while operating within the new collaborative framework. The neighborhood's physical transformation paralleled its governance evolution. The rigid uniformity, once enforced through violation notices and fines, had given way to a coherent diversity that actually enhanced aesthetic appeal. Professional landscapers visiting the area frequently commented on how the varied yet harmonious approaches to home maintenance created visual interest while maintaining high standards. "It's like the difference between a corporate chain restaurant and a vibrant local food scene," one architectural writer observed in a regional magazine feature. "One gives you bland consistency. The other offers distinctive character within a shared tradition." 3 years after that fateful eviction notice, I received an unexpected invitation. The National Association of Housing Authorities was hosting their annual conference in our city, and they wanted me to deliver the keynote. Address on community-led housing governance. The irony wasn't lost on me, from nearly homeless to housing policy expert in 36 months. The conference hall buzzed with housing professionals from across the country. As I took the stage, my service came now more an occasional support than a constant necessity, thanks to an innovative treatment program at the VA, looking out at the audience of property managers, developers, and public officials. I recognized an opportunity to challenge fundamental assumptions about what makes neighborhoods thrive. The conventional wisdom in housing management, I began, tells us that strict enforcement creates desirable communities, that uniformity equals quality, that property values depend on controlling resident behavior through increasingly detailed restrictions. I paused, letting the familiar doctrine settle before continuing. 3 years ago, I learned firsthand how that philosophy becomes a weapon when directed by those who confuse control with community. Today, I want to share how rejecting that model not only created a more humane neighborhood, but actually generated better financial outcomes than the enforcement approach ever did. The data I presented challenged the industry's core assumptions. Oakwood Heights property values had increased 23% since implementing our collaborative governance model, outperforming similar neighborhoods still using traditional HOA enforcement by nearly 8%. Resident turnover had decreased by 67%, dramatically reducing marketing and maintenance costs associated with frequent move-ins and move-outs. Even insurance claims had dropped as neighbors developed systems for identifying and addressing maintenance issues before they became serious problems. These aren't just feel-good metrics, I explained, advancing to slides showing detailed financial comparisons. This is the business case for community-centered housing management. When residents feel ownership, not just legal title, but genuine psychological investment, they maintain properties better than fear of fines ever motivated them to do. From the back of the hall, a hand raised during the question period. The woman who stood was immediately familiar, early 50s, expensively dressed, with that particular confident posture that comes from years of having the final say. "Your results are impressive," she acknowledged, "but aren't you concerned about long-term sustainability? Without enforcement mechanisms, what happens when homeowners inevitably start to let standards slip?" The question could have come directly from Barbara Wellington's playbook. I smiled, recognizing the underlying worldview it represented. "That concern assumes people only maintain standards under threat of punishment," I replied. "Our experience shows the opposite. When communities establish standards collectively rather than having them imposed, compliance becomes about relationship rather than rule following." 3 years in, our maintenance metrics continue to improve, not because of enforcement, but because of investment. The woman seemed unconvinced but nodded respectfully before sitting. Later, during the reception, she approached me directly, introducing herself as Catherine Blackwell, president of the state's largest property management association. "Your presentation has me rethinking some fundamental assumptions," she admitted, surprising me with her candor. "We've always operated on the principle that clear consequences drive compliance. But your retention numbers are impossible to ignore. The paradigm shift is moving from compliance to commitment," I explained. "People will invest extraordinary effort in communities where they feel valued and heard." Catherine's association ultimately funded a pilot program implementing elements of our approach in 5 test communities across the state. The resulting data would further validate what Oakwood Heights had demonstrated, that governance built on inclusion rather than exclusion created both stronger communities and better financial outcomes. The conference also connected me with allies working on parallel initiatives nationwide. Professor Elaine Montgomery from Georgetown's Urban Policy Center had been documenting discriminatory housing practices in seemingly neutral HOA regulations. Her research team had identified patterns showing how facially neutral rules often had severely disparate impacts on protected classes. The no commercial vehicles restriction your HOA tried to enforce against you, she explained during our meeting, appears in roughly 73% of association covenants nationwide. Our data shows it's enforced against blue-collar workers at nearly 4 times the rate of white-collar professionals, despite similar technical violations. Her research complemented our practical experience, providing the empirical foundation for policy reforms extending beyond individual communities. Together with legal advocates, disability rights organizations, and housing justice groups, we developed model legislation addressing the most common mechanisms of housing discrimination. Knowledge. Nugget 12. Seemingly neutral housing restrictions often have discriminatory impacts based on occupation, family status, disability, or cultural background. Always examine who is most affected by specific rules and who benefits from their enforcement. The Homeward Bound initiative continued expanding, with 7 properties now operating across 3 states. Each location maintained the core philosophy of universal design and community governance while adapting to local needs and opportunities. The San Antonio property included a culinary training program in partnership with local restaurants. The Denver location featured adaptive sports facilities co-developed with the VA Rehabilitation Center. Ryan Collins, our first resident, had completed his degree and joined our organization as Technology Accessibility Director, overseeing the smart home systems that made independent living possible for veterans with severe physical limitations. His service dog Valor, now recognized by residents across all our properties, had become our unofficial mascot. The transformation of Barbara Wellington remained perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire saga. After completing her required community service hours, she had pursued certification as a veteran service officer, a specialist who helps veterans navigate the complex benefit system. Her meticulous attention to detail and process, once directed toward rule enforcement, made her exceptionally effective at identifying overlooked benefit opportunities and challenging improper claim denials. We weren't friends. Too much history stood between us for that, but we had achieved something more important: mutual respect based on shared commitment to serving others. When Barbara successfully appealed a benefits denial for a quadriplegic veteran who had been waiting nearly 3 years for proper compensation, I sent her a handwritten note of congratulations. She responded with a simple message that acknowledged our journey, using my powers for good now. Thank you for the redirect. Our paths crossed professionally with increasing frequency as Homeward Bound expanded and Barbara's veteran advocacy work grew. During one particularly complex case involving a veteran with both physical disabilities and significant PTSD, we found ourselves collaborating to create a comprehensive support plan integrating housing, benefits, and mental health services. The system isn't designed for people to actually navigate it, Barbara observed as we sorted through the labyrinthine requirements for different support programs. It's almost like they're hoping veterans will get frustrated and give up. That's exactly why we need people who understand how to work through bureaucratic obstacles, I replied. Your persistence is actually saving lives when directed toward the right targets. She looked up from the paperwork, her expression reflective. I used to think I was protecting something valuable with all those HOA rules and enforcement actions. I never realized I was actually standing in the way of something much more important. The acknowledgement wasn't an apology, but it demonstrated how profoundly her perspective had shifted. The woman who had once tried to evict me for making my home accessible now dedicated her considerable organizational talents to ensuring other disabled veterans received the accommodations and support they needed. 5 years after the eviction notice that changed everything, I found myself standing on a different kind of front line. The state legislature was considering comprehensive HOA reform legislation, and I'd been invited to testify before the Housing Policy Committee. The marble corridors of the Capitol building couldn't have been further from the combat zones where I'd once served. Yet this battle for housing justice felt equally consequential for the lives it would impact. The hearing room was divided like some microcosm of the larger conflict: industry representatives and property management lobbyists on one side, consumer advocates and housing rights organizations on the other. Committee members shuffled papers and checked phones as the session began. Many likely already decided based on campaign contributions rather than policy merits. When my turn came to speak, I approached the microphone with the confidence that Comey's from lived experience rather than rehearsed talking points. Distinguished committee members, my name is James Reeves. I'm a disabled combat veteran, a technology entrepreneur, and someone who experienced firsthand how HOA overreach can threaten the fundamental right to housing. I detailed my experience with Barbara Wellington's discriminatory enforcement campaign, the illegal eviction attempt, and the subsequent discovery of the HOA as questionable legal foundation. But I'm not here to tell war stories, either from Afghanistan or from my neighborhood, I continued. I'm here to present evidence that the model we've developed provides a viable alternative to the enforcement-based approach that dominates community associations today. The data spoke for itself. 5 years of metrics from Oakwood Heights demonstrated superior outcomes across every meaningful measurement: property values, resident satisfaction, maintenance standards, and financial stability compared to similar communities using traditional enforcement models. The evidence from our 7 homeward-bound properties showed even more dramatic results, particularly in quality-of-life indicators for disabled residents. The legislation before you today wouldn't mandate our approach, I explained, addressing the industry's primary talking point. It would simply create basic protections against the most egregious abuses while requiring the transparency that allows homeowners to make informed decisions about their communities. The questioning from committee members revealed the political fault lines. Representative Jordan, whose campaign had received significant funding from property management interests, focused on hypothetical worst-case scenarios. Without strong enforcement capabilities, what's to prevent a homeowner from painting their house neon green or parking a broken-down RV in the front yard? He demanded, recycling industry talking points almost verbatim. The same thing that prevents most people from doing that now, I responded. It's not fear of fines, but community standards established through relationship rather than coercion. Our data shows that violations actually decreased after moving to a collaborative model. Senator Vasquez, representing a district with significant veteran population, asked more substantive questions about housing accessibility. In your experience, how do current HOA practices specifically impact disabled veterans attempting to modify homes for accessibility? The approval processes often create insurmountable barriers, I explained. Veterans with PTSD may lack the emotional resources to fight prolonged battles over minor modifications. Those with physical disabilities face delays that compromise their daily functioning. And the financial penalties imposed during these disputes can devastate those living on fixed disability incomes. The testimony continued for hours, with industry representatives warning of property value apocalypse if their enforcement powers were curtailed in any way. Their arguments remained remarkably similar to Barbara Wellington's original justifications: protection of community standards that somehow always seemed to exclude certain types of people. The committee ultimately advanced a compromise bill that incorporated many of our key recommendations while making concessions to industry concerns. It wasn't everything we'd advocated for, but it established meaningful protections against discriminatory enforcement and created transparency requirements that would empower homeowners to challenge association overreach. Knowledge. Nugget 13. Legislative change requires persistence across multiple sessions. Most significant reforms happen incrementally rather than through single comprehensive bills. Build coalitions for long-term advocacy rather than expecting immediate total victory As the policy work continued, Oakwood Heights itself evolved beyond my direct influence. The governance model we'd established had taken root deeply enough to withstand leadership transitions and community changes. New residents embraced the collaborative approach, often citing it as a primary reason they'd chosen our neighborhood over other options. The physical environment reflected this evolution. What had once been cookie-cutter homes distinguished only by slight color variations within Barbara's approved palette had become a cohesive yet diverse streetscape. Gardens reflected cultural traditions from across the globe. Architectural modifications expressed individual needs and preferences while maintaining structural integrity and safety. The community spaces hosted everything from cultural celebrations to mutual aid initiatives. Most remarkably, the children of Oakwood Heights moved freely through the neighborhood in a way that had been impossible under the previous regime. Where Barbara had once filed violation notices against families whose children left bicycles visible or played too loudly in communal areas, the community now deliberately created child-friendly spaces and intergenerational activities. The contrast became particularly evident during the annual Heritage Festival, an event that would have been prohibited under the old rules against excessive gatherings. Neighbors from across cultural backgrounds shared traditional foods, music, and customs while children played games from various traditions. The basketball court that Barbara had tried to eliminate as attracting undesirable elements now hosted tournaments organized by teenage residents who had developed their own leadership council. During one such festival, I encountered Gregory Phillips, the former board member who had once photographed my allies to create Barbara's blacklist. He was helping coordinate the cultural performance schedule, working alongside families he had previously targeted for enforcement. I actually believe in what we're doing now," he admitted as we watched a group of children learning traditional Filipino dance steps from Mrs. Santos. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood before, but all we were really doing was preventing it from becoming a genuine community." His transformation, like Barbara's, demonstrated something profound about human potential. The same energy and commitment they had once directed toward exclusion and control now supported inclusion and collaboration. Their fundamental personalities hadn't changed. Gregory was still meticulous about schedules. Barbara still passionate about standards. But the values guiding their actions had undergone a complete revolution. This pattern repeated throughout the community. Former antagonists found purpose in constructive roles that utilized their strengths without weaponizing them against neighbors. The banker who had rubber-stamped Barbara's financial decisions now helped run a community loan fund, supporting resident improvement projects. The landscape architect who had once reported non-conforming plant species now led workshops on water-efficient gardening that incorporated diverse botanical traditions. The neighborhood's transformation attracted academic interest beyond Professor Montgomery's housing discrimination research. Sociologists studied our governance model for insights into community building processes. Urban planners analyzed how our approach to shared spaces created genuine interaction rather than merely proximity. Even economists examined how our property value increases challenged conventional wisdom about what makes neighborhoods desirable. 7 years after the confrontation that transformed Oakwood Heights, an unexpected letter arrived at my office. The return address showed a federal correctional institution in Colorado, and the sender's name stopped me cold: Thomas Wellington. Barbara's husband had never been part of our story, at least not visibly. During the entire HOA conflict, he had remained a shadowy figure mentioned occasionally but never encountered directly. The letter inside was handwritten on standard prison stationery, the penmanship precise and controlled. "Mr. Reeves," it began formally, "you don't know me, but my actions have affected your life significantly. I'm serving a 10-year sentence for financial crimes unrelated to our Oakwood Heights connection, but my imprisonment has provided time for reflection that was long overdue. He explained that while Barbara had been the public face of the HOA enforcement campaign, he had been the driving force behind it. His real estate development company had been quietly purchasing properties throughout Oakwood Heights, executing a long-term strategy to acquire enough homes to force rezoning for commercial development. The consistent enforcement of HOA restrictions was designed to make the neighborhood less livable for certain residents, he admitted in the letter. We specifically targeted properties where owners might be vulnerable to pressure elderly residents, those with limited English proficiency, and yes, disabled individuals like yourself who might require accommodations that could be denied. His confession continued with disturbing clarity. The harassment campaign against me hadn't been merely about aesthetic preferences or property values. It had been a calculated effort to remove a homeowner who might resist their development plans. My adaptive modifications and disability accommodations had provided convenient pretexts for enforcement actions that were actually motivated by commercial interests. Barbara initially believed we were simply maintaining standards, he wrote. I encouraged her property value concerns, while hiding our actual intention to eventually demolish those same properties for commercial development. When you acquired the developer rights and additional properties, you unknowingly dismantled a scheme years in the making. The letter concluded with something approaching remorse. My crimes caught up with me in other ventures, but I wanted you to know that your stand against what appeared to be petty HOA tyranny actually prevented the destruction of an entire community. I won't ask for forgiveness, but I felt you deserved to know the truth. I sat with this revelation for days, unsure how to process it. The conflict I'd experienced as discrimination and harassment had actually been something even more insidious, a deliberate strategy to displace vulnerable residents for corporate profit. The community we'd saved had been targeted for elimination, not just regulation. After consulting with legal advisors, I shared Thomas Wellington's letter with select community leaders who had been involved in the original conflict. Their reactions mirrored my own shock and retrospective clarity. Certain enforcement patterns that had seemed merely capricious now revealed strategic targeting of specific properties along potential commercial corridors. Knowledge nugget 14. Discriminatory housing practices often mask financial motives beyond simple property values. Follow the money to understand who benefits from seemingly arbitrary restrictions and enforcement actions. The Wellington revelation prompted us to create additional safeguards in our governance structure. We established a community land trust for key properties, ensuring they would remain residential regardless of ownership changes. We strengthened transparency requirements for property transactions involving multiple units. Most importantly, we documented the attempted exploitation to inform policy advocacy beyond our neighborhood. This new understanding of what we'd faced and overcome added depth to the community's shared narrative. What had begun as my personal battle against discrimination had revealed a larger pattern of exploitation targeting vulnerable communities nationwide. The presentations I now gave at housing policy conferences included this critical insight. Housing discrimination often serves as cover for commercial exploitation. Senator Vasquez, who had supported our legislative reform efforts, requested a private meeting after learning about Thomas Wellington's confession. This is exactly the pattern we're seeing across the state, she explained, spreading maps across her office table showing targeted enforcement actions that correlated with subsequent commercial development. HOA restrictions become weapons for commercial interests to clear residential areas without triggering fair housing investigations. Our collaboration expanded to include research tracking these patterns systematically. The resulting report, Exclusion by Design, documented how seemingly neutral community restrictions often facilitated commercial acquisition strategies targeting vulnerable populations. The findings informed federal regulatory guidance strengthening protections against predatory development practices disguised as community standards. Barbara Wellington's role in this larger scheme remained ambiguous. Had she been a knowing participant or an unwitting tool in her husband's commercial strategy? Her transformation into an advocate for veterans suggested the latter, though perhaps with a level of willful ignorance about the ultimate objectives she was serving. I finally discussed Thomas's letter with her, directly during a veterans benefits workshop we were both attending. Her initial shock seemed genuine, followed by a complexity of emotions playing across her face: disbelief, anger, humiliation, and finally a resigned recognition. I suspected something wasn't right with the investment properties, she admitted, but I convinced myself it was legitimate wealth building. Thomas always handled the financial aspects while I focused on community standards, the perfect division of labor for plausible deniability. Her voice carried the particular pain of someone confronting their own complicity in harm they hadn't fully understood. I really believed I was protecting something valuable. Even when I was clearly targeting you and others, I justified it as necessary for the greater good of the community. That conversation marked another evolution in our complex relationship, not friendship, but a partnership in preventing others from experiencing similar exploitation. Barbara's inside knowledge of how HOA mechanisms could be weaponized made her uniquely valuable in developing countermeasures and educational materials. Meanwhile, Oakwood Heights continued flourishing under its resident-led governance model. The Community Land Trust now included 15 properties permanently dedicated to affordable housing, ensuring economic diversity even as surrounding neighborhoods became increasingly exclusive. The Community Business Incubator had launched 7 successful enterprises owned by residents, creating both local jobs and wealth-building opportunities. Most significantly, the social fabric had strengthened beyond what external metrics could measure. When Mrs. Patterson experienced a serious health crisis, neighbors organized a comprehensive support system: meal deliveries, transportation to medical appointments, home maintenance, and regular companionship without any formal coordination. Mechanism. The community's capacity for mutual aid had become self-sustaining, operating through relationship networks rather than administrative structures. This organic support system extended to newcomers as well. When a recently arrived family from Vietnam experienced a house fire, they found themselves embraced by a community response that transcended cultural and language differences. Temporary housing, replacement of essential items, and assistance navigating insurance claims all materialized through the same networks that had once organized resistance to Barbara's enforcement regime. The contrast with the neighborhood's previous incarnation couldn't have been more stark. What had once been a collection of adjacent properties, united only by restrictive covenants, had become a genuine community capable of responding to both celebrations and crises with equal effectiveness. The transformation validated everything we had fought for and built together. 10 years after Barbara Wellington slapped that eviction notice on my door, I found myself addressing the National Veterans Housing Conference in Washington, D.C. The journey from nearly homeless veteran to recognized housing policy expert still occasionally struck me as surreal, particularly as I looked out at an audience that included cabinet secretaries, congressional representatives, and military leadership. The housing crisis facing disabled veterans isn't just about physical accessibility, I explained, advancing through slides showing outcomes from our expanded Homeward Bound initiative, now operating 23 properties across 11 states. It's about creating environments where recovery physical, psychological, and social becomes possible through deliberate design and community structure. The data told a compelling story. Veterans in our integrated housing communities showed dramatically better outcomes across multiple metrics: 67% reduction in hospitalizations, 82% decrease in suicidal ideation, 74% lower relapse rates for those with substance use disorders, and 89% higher employment retention compared to similar populations in conventional housing. These results don't come from clinical interventions alone. I continued, highlighting the community governance structures that had evolved from our Oakwood Heights model. They emerge from environments where residents have genuine agency, where mutual support occurs organically, and where differences are viewed as contributions rather than deficits. Following the presentation, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs requested a private meeting. In a wood-paneled conference room overlooking the National Mall, she expressed both admiration and frustration. "What you've built works demonstrably better than our current approaches," she acknowledged. "But scaling these solutions through federal systems presents significant challenges. How do we incorporate your community-centered approach into institutions designed around centralized authority?" It was the central question of our work's next phase, translating successful local models into systemic change. The answer involved fundamental shifts in how we conceptualized housing policy, moving from housing as mere shelter to housing as the foundation for community health and individual recovery. "The key insight from our experience," I explained, "is that genuine healing happens in communities where people have both security and agency. The regulatory frameworks need to support that combination rather than prioritizing compliance over well-being." The meeting led to a pilot partnership integrating elements of our model into VA housing programs at 5 test locations. The initiative represented a significant shift in federal approach from housing as a management challenge to housing as a recovery environment. Preliminary results showed promising improvements even within institutional constraints, creating momentum for broader implementation. Knowledge Nugget 15. Systemic change requires working both outside and inside existing institutions. Demonstrate alternatives through independent projects while simultaneously reforming established systems from within. Back in Oakwood Heights, the 10-year anniversary of our governance transformation became an opportunity for community reflection. The celebration included an oral history project where residents shared their experiences of the neighborhood's evolution. Listening to these diverse perspectives from original homeowners who remembered Barbara's enforcement regime to newcomers who had only known the collaborative model revealed how thoroughly the community's self-conception had changed. Mrs. Patel, now in her 70s, captured this transformation while speaking to a group of urban planning students documenting our experience. "We used to define our community by what wasn't allowed. Now we define it by what we create together." This shift from prohibition to creation characterized every aspect of neighborhood life. The community garden that Barbara had once cited for unauthorized agricultural activity now produced fresh food for both residents and local food banks. The Skills Exchange program connected neighbors for everything from language tutoring to home repairs. The Cultural Heritage Committee organized celebrations honoring the diverse traditions represented within our few square blocks. The physical environment reflected this philosophy as well. What had once been rigidly uniform housing now expressed a coherent diversity, individual expression within a harmonious whole. Universal design principles, initially implemented for disability accessibility, had improved functionality for all residents, demonstrating how accommodations often create better environments for everyone. Barbara Wellington herself had become an unlikely but effective advocate for housing justice beyond our community. Her intimate knowledge of how HOA mechanisms could be weaponized made her testimony particularly powerful in legislative hearings and regulatory proceedings. She had developed a specialty in identifying discriminatory patterns disguised as neutral community standards, helping housing authorities recognize and address hidden barriers. During the anniversary celebration, she approached me with uncharacteristic hesitation. "I've been offered a position with the State Housing Commission," she said. "They want someone who understands how discrimination operates in seemingly neutral systems." "You'd be excellent at identifying those patterns," I acknowledged, recognizing how her transformation had come full circle. The same analytical skills she had once used to target non-conforming Residents would now help protect vulnerable communities from similar treatment. I wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable with me accepting the position, she continued. Given our history, I wouldn't want it to create complications for your advocacy work. The consideration represented how profoundly her perspective had shifted. The woman who had once attempted to force me from my home now sought my blessing for her housing justice work, not from guilt or obligation, but from genuine recognition of our interconnected efforts. The Commission would benefit from your insights. I told her honestly, just as our community ultimately benefited from the crisis you created that forced us to build something better. Her slight smile acknowledged the complex truth of our journey adversaries transformed into allies through conflict that had ultimately served a greater purpose than either of us had initially imagined. The neighborhood we'd built together, each from opposite starting positions, had become a model for inclusive community governance nationwide. The eviction notice that had once threatened to displace me had instead launched a movement that was now housing thousands of veterans and transforming how communities approach governance. The threat had become opportunity. The crisis had created possibility. And the neighborhood that had once rejected me for my disabilities had become a place where difference was not merely tolerated, but valued as essential to community strength. 15 years after that rainy Thursday when I found the eviction notice on my door, I stood at a podium in New York City accepting the Urban Innovation Award for Transformative Community Governance. The recognition wasn't just for Oakwood Heights or even the Homeward Bound initiative, which had grown to include 57 properties nationwide. It acknowledged the broader movement we'd helped catalyze, a fundamental reimagining of how communities can govern themselves through collaboration rather than coercion. This award belongs to everyone who believed a different approach was possible. I told the audience of urban planners, policy experts, and community leaders, especially to those who initially opposed us, then found the courage to change. Our story demonstrates that transformation is possible not just for individuals, but for entire systems of governance and community organization. The journey from nearly evicted veteran to internationally recognized community development leader had been neither linear nor simple. There had been setbacks alongside successes, resistance alongside breakthroughs. The legislative reforms we'd championed had faced continuous opposition from industry groups defending their enforcement powers. The VA pilot programs integrating our housing model had confronted institutional inertia at every level, yet the evidence had become increasingly undeniable. Communities using our collaborative governance approach consistently outperformed traditional models across every meaningful metric, from property values and maintenance standards to resident well-being and social cohesion. The data had gradually shifted the conversation from ideological debates about control versus freedom to practical assessments of what actually produced better outcomes. After the ceremony, a young veteran approached me, her prosthetic arm visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. "Your work is why I have a home where I can actually heal," she said simply. Before moving into Homeward Bound Denver, I'd been rejected from 7 apartment complexes because of my service dog and PTSD accommodations. Her story echoed my own experience from 15 years earlier, but with a crucial difference. She had found a pathway to housing security that hadn't existed when I faced similar barriers. The systems we'd built had created alternatives to the discrimination and exclusion that had once seemed inevitable. Knowledge Nugget 16. Lasting change requires building alternatives, not just opposing problems. Create the solutions you want to see implemented rather than merely resisting what exists. Back in Oakwood Heights, the original neighborhood that had started everything, a new generation of leadership had emerged. The community board now included young families, retirees, recent immigrants, and longtime residents working collaboratively to address evolving needs. The governance structures we'd established had proven sufficiently flexible to adapt without losing their core principles of inclusion and shared Decision-making. The physical transformation had continued as well. What had once been cookie-cutter houses distinguished only by slight variations in Barbara's approved color palette had evolved into a neighborhood with distinctive character while maintaining harmony. Universal design principles had become standard, making homes accessible for residents across the lifespan. Sustainable features, solar panels, rainwater collection systems, native landscaping had been integrated without the endless approval battles that would have occurred under the old regime. Perhaps most significantly, the community had developed resilience that extended beyond housing issues. When economic downturns hit, neighbors created mutual aid networks providing everything from job referrals to childcare. When climate events threatened, the emergency response systems activated immediately, with particular attention to vulnerable residents. What had begun as a battle over parking a truck and building an access ramp had evolved into a comprehensive approach to community well-being. Barbara Wellington, now Commissioner Wellington of the State Housing Authority, had become an unlikely but effective champion for disability rights and housing policy. Her recent initiatives had focused on strengthening reasonable accommodation requirements and addressing subtle forms of discrimination hidden within seemingly neutral regulations. Her transformation from HOA tyrant to housing justice advocate remained the most unexpected outcome of our long conflict. During a recent policy conference where we both presented, she reflected on her journey with surprising candor. "I used to believe that uniformity created value," she told the audience during her keynote. "I now understand that genuine community value comes from creating environments where diversity is not just accommodated but embraced as essential to collective resilience." Looking back on 15 years of transformation, personal, community, and systemic, the contrast between what had been and what now existed still occasionally took my breath away. The neighborhood that had once tried to evict me for making my home accessible now served as a national model for inclusive community design. The HOA president who had orchestrated that eviction attempt now led statewide efforts to prevent similar discrimination. The veteran who had once stood alone against seemingly insurmountable opposition now led a movement transforming housing for thousands of former service members. The most expensive lesson Barbara Wellington ever learned had ultimately proven valuable beyond measure, not just for me, but for communities nationwide. The price she paid was her misguided certainty about who belonged and what created value. The dividend we all received was a new understanding of how communities thrive not through control and exclusion, but through collaboration and inclusion. Sometimes I still stand in my driveway, leaning slightly on my cane, and remember that rainy day when an eviction notice threatened everything I had built. The anger I felt then has long since transformed into something more powerful, the satisfaction of having built something better than what I was defending. The neighborhood I fought to remain in has become something greater than what either side in that conflict could have imagined. When new residents ask about our unique governance model, I tell them the story not as a tale of personal vindication, but as evidence that communities can evolve beyond enforcement towards something more effective and humane. The lesson isn't that I won and Barbara lost, it's that both of us, and the entire community, found a better way forward through conflict that could have destroyed everything. 20 years after that fateful eviction notice, I found myself back where everything began, standing in my driveway at Oakwood Heights. The neighborhood had changed in countless ways, yet retained the essential character we'd built together through 2 decades of collaborative governance. The morning light filtered through mature trees that had been saplings when this journey started, casting dappled shadows across homes that now expressed both individual identity and community cohesion. My own role had evolved significantly. The demands of overseeing Homeward Bound's national expansion and advising federal housing policy had gradually reduced my direct involvement in day-to-day neighborhood governance. Younger leaders had stepped forward, bringing fresh perspectives, while maintaining the core principles we'd established. This natural succession was perhaps our greatest success, creating systems resilient enough to thrive beyond their founders. The occasion for my reflective moment was bittersweet. After 20 years, I had decided to sell my home in Oakwood Heights. The homeward-bound headquarters had relocated to Washington, D.C., where our policy impact could be maximized, and my frequent travel made maintaining the property increasingly impractical. More importantly, the neighborhood no longer needed my presence to sustain what we'd built together. Ryan Collins, that young Marine with a traumatic brain injury who had become our first homeward-bound resident 15 years earlier, now served as the organization's executive director. Under his leadership, the initiative had expanded to include specialized programs addressing homelessness among female veterans, culturally specific support for Indigenous veterans, and transitional housing for recently returned service members. The vision had grown far beyond what I alone could have accomplished. Knowledge nut at 17. True leadership creates systems that continue functioning after the leader departs. Success isn't measured by personal indispensability, but by organizational sustainability and succession planning. The prospective buyers of my home represented exactly what Oakwood Heights had become: a young family with roots in 3 different countries, including a child with disabilities who would benefit from the accessible design features I'd once fought to install. Their excitement about joining a community with collaborative governance rather than restrictive enforcement confirmed how thoroughly the neighborhood's reputation had transformed. Barbara Wellington attended the farewell gathering my neighbors organized, her presence no longer surprising after years of reconciliation and parallel advocacy work. Now in her 70s, she had recently retired from her housing commissioner role, but continued consulting on discrimination prevention initiatives nationwide. "I've been thinking about how different things might have been," she said as we stood on the back deck, watching children play in yards that had once been subject to her meticulous measurement. "If I had simply approved your ramp request 20 years ago, none of this would exist." The observation captured the strange alchemy of conflict, how opposition can sometimes create possibilities that cooperation might never have revealed. Her enforcement campaign had inadvertently catalyzed a movement that had improved housing conditions for thousands of veterans and transformed community governance models nationwide. "Sometimes the worst experiences produce the most important changes," I replied, watching a child in a wheelchair effortlessly navigate the accessible playground that had replaced the restricted common area Barbara had once patrolled for violations. Neither of us could have imagined this outcome when we were adversaries. The community that gathered to mark my departure spanned generations and experiences. Original residents who remembered Barbara's enforcement regime shared stories with newcomers who had only known the collaborative model. Veterans from homeward-bound properties across the country had traveled to express gratitude for systems that had supported their reintegration and recovery. Housing policy experts and community organizers came to acknowledge the ripple effects of what had begun as one disabled veteran's stand against discriminatory eviction. As I prepared to leave the home where this journey had begun, I realized that the true legacy wasn't in physical structures or even formal governance systems. It lay in the fundamental shift in understanding about what creates community value. Not uniformity imposed through punishment, but diversity embraced through collaboration. Not property values protected at the expense of people, but human connections that ultimately enhance both quality of life and economic stability. The neighborhood that had once sought to evict me for being different had become a place where difference was recognized as essential to collective resilience. The HOA president who had led that campaign had become an advocate for the very accommodations she had once denied. And the disabled veteran who had simply wanted to remain in his adapted home had discovered purpose in creating housing security. For thousands like himself, sometimes the most expensive lessons produce the most valuable transformations, not just for those who learn them, but for entire communities discovering better ways to govern themselves and create genuine belonging. As I handed the keys to the new family moving into my Oakwood Heights home, I felt a profound sense of completion. Their young daughter, using a wheelchair similar to what I'd needed during my worst recovery periods, beamed as she discovered the accessible features that had once been the center of such conflict. Her joy represented everything we'd fought for, creating spaces where difference wasn't just accommodated, but welcomed. That afternoon, standing at the community center that had once been the fortress of HOA enforcement, I addressed the neighbors who had gathered for a final farewell. Looking out at faces both familiar and new, I saw the living legacy of our shared journey. 20 years ago, I received an eviction notice that was meant to force me out of this community, I told them. Instead, it became the first page of a story about transformation, personal, communal, and eventually national. What began as discrimination became the catalyst for creating something better than what we were fighting to preserve. As I prepared to leave, Mrs. Patel pressed something into my hand, the original eviction notice, carefully preserved all these years. "You should keep this," she said with a knowing smile. Some battles change more than just who wins or loses. They change what's possible for everyone. Today, the Homeward Bound initiative houses over 15,000 veterans across all 50 states. The governance model that began in Oakwood Heights has been implemented in communities worldwide. And Barbara Wellington's discriminatory eviction attempt has become a case study taught in housing policy programs across the country, not as a failure, but as the unexpected beginning of a revolution in community governance. If you're facing your own housing battle against seemingly insurmountable odds, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't just winning the fight, it's transforming the entire system that made it possible. Drop a comment sharing your HOA experiences, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people creating extraordinary change when pushed too far. Sometimes the most expensive lessons create the most valuable transformations.